Right now, as you watch this, you cannot be certain that the last face you saw online belonged to a living human being. Think about that for a moment. The video you scrolled past this morning, the voice that answered your call, the stranger smiling at you from a profile photo, the comment that felt so human it made you laugh. In 2026, for the first time in recorded history, the line between a real human face and a manufactured one has quietly, completely dissolved. The tools exist now. They are free. They are everywhere. A face that has never lived can look you in the eye, blink, hesitate, breathe, and lie to you. And your brain, the most sophisticated face-reading instrument that 4 million years of evolution ever produced, will accept it without a flicker of doubt. They are calling it the dead internet. The unsettling suspicion that much of what you see, read, and feel a connection to is no longer made by people at all. That you are surrounded, every hour of every day, by entities wearing human faces that are not human. And the most frightening part is not that they are out there. The most frightening part is that you can no longer tell. You look, and you cannot tell. You have lost the one ability you never imagined you could lose. The ability to know whether the thing in front of you is one of your own kind. But here is what almost no one watching this knows. This fear is not new. It is not born of technology. It is the oldest fear humanity ever wrote down. Because 4,000 years ago, in the river-mud cities of southern Mesopotamia, the Sumerians pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay and recorded a warning so specific, so deliberate, that reading it today makes the hair rise on the back of your neck. They wrote of beings who looked exactly like men, who walked among the people, who taught them everything. And they wrote something else. Something the dry voice of the clay states almost in passing. The way you mention a detail you assume everyone already knows. They wrote that when these beings finished their work, they returned to the deep waters from which they had come. All of them but one of them, the tablet records, never went back. So before we go any further, hold that single thread in your mind, because everything turns on it. One of them stayed, and the people who wrote it down were not telling a fairy tale to frighten children. They were keeping a record. They believed they were writing history. The question this video is going to ask you to sit with is simple, and it is the reason the ancients carved it into stone instead of trusting it to memory. If something that looks exactly like us decided to remain among us, and if we have only just now lost the ability to tell the difference, how would you ever know? Let us begin where the record begins. The Sumerians did not call them aliens. They did not have that idea. They called them the apkallu, 7 of them, the 7 sages. And the most extraordinary thing about the apkallu is not what they did, but what they looked like, and where the texts insist they came from. The cuneiform sources, copied and recopied, for over 1,000 years across Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, describe the apkallu as beings who emerged from the Abzu, the primordial freshwater abyss beneath the earth, the deep underground ocean. The Sumerians believed lay below the surface of the world. They came up out of the water, and when they walked onto the land and stood before the first human beings, they wore the appearance of men. That detail matters more than any other. So let us be precise about what the documents actually say, because here we are standing on solid ground. The most complete account does not survive in Sumerian at all. It survives because of a Babylonian priest named Berossus, who lived in the 3rd century before the Common Era and wrote a history of his people in Greek for the wider world. His original work is lost, but other ancient writers quoted him so extensively that we can reconstruct what he reported, and what he reported is astonishing. Berossus describes a being he calls Oannes. In the very first year, he writes, there appeared from the sea, from the part of it that borders Babylonia, a creature endowed with reason. Its body was that of a fish, but beneath the fish-like form, it had the head of a man, and feet like a man, and it spoke with a human voice. By day this being came up out of the water and lived among the people, eating nothing, and it taught them. It taught them writing. It taught them the sciences, and every kind of skilled craft. It taught them how to found cities, how to build temples, how to make laws, how to measure the land, how to gather seed and bring in the harvest. It gave humanity, in Berossus' own words, everything that softens the savagery of human life. And then, when the sun went down, this being would go back down into the sea and spend the night in the deep, for it was, he writes, amphibious. And Berossus adds one more detail that should make you lean closer to the screen. He says that after Oannes, in the reigns of the kings who followed, other such creatures appeared, that this was not a single visitor, but a sequence of them, arriving across generations, each adding to what the first had begun. And he says something that historians have found genuinely difficult to dismiss, that nothing further was added to these teachings afterward. The implication, buried in the dry summary of a priest writing for foreigners, is staggering. Everything that made civilization possible, the writing system, the law codes, the mathematics, the astronomy that let the Babylonians predict eclipses centuries before anyone else on Earth, all of it, Berossus claims, was delivered in that single ancient burst and then merely preserved, not developed, received, handed down whole by beings from the water, and guarded ever after. Now set that beside what archaeology actually finds in the ground of southern Iraq, because this is the part that keeps the question alive. The rise of Sumer is one of the genuine puzzles of human history. Writing appears at Uruk around 5,000 years ago, not as crude scratches that slowly evolve, but with startling sophistication. The wheel, the plow, irrigation on a massive scale, monumental temple architecture, the first cities of tens of thousands of people, codified law, they cluster together in a window so narrow that the conventional phrase for it, among scholars, is the Sumerian takeoff. Mainstream historians explain it through agriculture, surplus, trade, and the pressures of dense population. And that explanation is sober and well supported, and I am not waving it away. But here is the uncomfortable symmetry. The Sumerians themselves were asked, in effect, where all of this came from, and they did not say we figured it out. They said it was given to us by the ones who came up out of the water wearing the shape of men. Stop and consider how strange this is as a piece of testimony. This is not myth as we usually meet it. There is no grand battle, no romance, no moral fable. It reads like a report. A creature came out of the water. It looked partly like a fish and partly like a man. It taught us how to be civilized. It went back into the water at night. Mainstream scholars read this, reasonably, as myth, as the Mesopotamians' poetic way of explaining where their astonishingly sudden civilization came from. And that may be exactly what it is. We have to be honest about that. This is where the documented record ends and the question begins. But notice what the record itself is so careful to preserve. Not a monster, not a god in the sky, but a teacher who looked enough like a man to live among men, walking the streets of the first cities, and then quietly slipping away into the dark water each night when no one could follow. Now hold on, because before we go deeper into who these beings were, there is an image I promised you, and it is the one that makes archaeologists uncomfortable to this day. In the dry coastal desert of Paracas, in southern Peru, on the far side of the planet, from Mesopotamia, lie ancient burials. And in those burials are human skulls, real skulls. You can see them in the museum at Ica right now, that are profoundly, unmistakably elongated, stretched, the cranium pulled back and up into a long tapering shape, utterly unlike a normal human head. We will return to those skulls and to the genetic controversy that erupted around them, because they sit at the exact center of the question this whole video is asking. How do you tell something that looks like us from something that only appears to play? Keep them in your mind. Hold them next to the fish-cloaked teachers of the river. We are going to bring those two threads together, and when we do, the picture changes. Back to the apkallu, because the texts have more to give us, and it gets stranger. The Seven Sages were not a single event. According to the Sumerian and Babylonian tradition, there were 7 of them, and each one was associated with one of the antediluvian kings, the legendary rulers who reigned, the king lists insist, before the Great Flood. Every one of those first kings had his apkallu beside him, an advisor, a counselor with knowledge no human possessed. The texts present this not as decoration, but as the engine of civilization itself. Humanity did not invent its arts and sciences through slow trial and error. The arts and sciences were given, delivered, fully formed by these 7 beings who rose from the water wearing the shape of men, and the texts give them names. This is not a vague legend with the faces rubbed out. The first and greatest of them, the one Berossus called Oannes, appears in the cuneiform sources as Oannes or Adapa, the sage of the very first king, the being who is said to have brought the original gift of knowledge to the city of Eridu, the oldest city the Sumerians knew, the place they believed kingship itself had descended from heaven. After him come the others, each named, each tied to a king, each remembered for a particular domain of wisdom. The list survives on a tablet known to scholars as the Uruk list of kings and sages, a document that pairs ruler with sage, generation by generation, like a genealogy of hidden teachers running parallel to the genealogy of men. Think about what that means. The Mesopotamians kept a record not only of their kings, but of the non-human counselors standing behind each throne, and they kept it with the same bureaucratic seriousness they used for grain shipments and property deeds. These were not bedtime stories to them. They were administrative fact, and there is a darker turn in the catalogue that most retellings leave out. After the Great Flood, the tradition says the pure apkallu were gone, but the line did not vanish cleanly. The later texts speak of beings who were part apkallu and part human, descendants of mixed origin, sages, who carried the old blood diluted into mortal flesh. One Assyrian source describes a figure who was, in its words, 2/3 apkallu, a being not fully of the deep and not fully of the earth, walking the world with a heritage that was no longer entirely human and no longer entirely divine. Read that slowly. The very record we are following does not say the strange blood ended with the flood. It says it thinned. It says it continued. It says it walked on, 2/3 of something, into the world of ordinary men, and it kept count. And here is a detail that the modern eye almost cannot help but seize on. In Mesopotamian art, the apkallu are shown in a very particular way. We have the carvings, we have the reliefs from the great Assyrian palaces, where protective apkallu figures line the walls. And again they are depicted wearing the skin of a great fish over their bodies, the fish head rising above the human head like a hood or a helmet, the fish body hanging down the back like a cloak. A cloak. Read that carefully, and let the unease settle in. The very oldest images we have of these beings show them not as fishmen, but as men wearing the covering of a fish over a human form, a disguise, a costume that lets something move through the world looking like one thing, while being, underneath, something else. The Mesopotamians had a word that hovers around these beings, and it is worth saying plainly because it carries weight. The cuneiform sign that scholars transliterate as din-jir, pronounced in the related Semitic languages as ilu, the source of the Hebrew el and the Arabic Allah, meant a divine or shining one. It is the word stamped before the names of gods, but the line between the divine ones and the apkallu in these texts is not a clean wall. The sages partake of that nature. They are described with reverence, with fear, as bearers of a knowledge that did not belong to men and was never meant for men. They were among the people, but they were not of the people. They wore the shape, but the shape was a covering. And now we have to be careful and honest, because here the trail crosses into another book that almost everyone watching has heard of, and the parallel is too exact to ignore. But it is a parallel, and I will not pretend it is more than that. Open the Hebrew Bible to the 6th chapter of Genesis, just before the flood, the same flood the Sumerian king lists place right after the age of the apkallu. There is a passage so brief and so strange that translators have argued over it for 2,000 years. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives from among them. And it says that in those days there were Nephilim on the earth, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men. The Nephilim. The word is usually rendered as giants, but its root suggests the fallen ones, or those who cause others to fall. Mighty ones, men of renown, beings that were not quite human, that came from above or beyond, that looked enough like men to take human wives and father children with them. Look at the shape of these two records, separated by culture, by language, by hundreds of miles. In Sumer, beings who are not human come among humanity before the flood, look like men, and give them knowledge. In Genesis, beings who are not human come among humanity before the flood, look like men, take human partners, and the result is a generation that had to be wiped from the earth by water. Two peoples, writing independently, both place the same uncanny event at the same point in their history, the moment just before everything was drowned and the world began again. Mainstream scholarship reads both as mythology as the shared folklore of the ancient Near East, and that is a defensible reading. I want you to hear it clearly, but folklore does not usually agree on its details by accident, and the detail both traditions cannot stop circling is the same one technology has just forced back into our lives. Something that is not us can wear the face of us, and it can live among us undetected, long enough to change the course of the species. So how would you spot one? If the oldest texts on Earth are telling the truth, even a buried, distorted, half-remembered truth, what would the difference look like? This is where we come back to the skulls, and to your own brain, and where the documented science gets genuinely unsettling on its own terms. Return with me to Paracas. The elongated skulls there are real. That is not in dispute. What is disputed is how they came to be that shape. The standard, well-evidenced explanation is cranial deformation, the practice, found in many ancient cultures around the world, of binding an infant's soft skull between boards or with tight wrapping, so that as it grows it lengthens. This is documented, it is real, and it accounts for a great many elongated skulls across history. But some researchers who have examined the Paracas specimens have claimed features that binding alone struggles to explain: a cranial volume larger than normal, the absence of the sagittal suture that runs across the top of a normal human skull, and other anatomical oddities. In the last decade, samples were sent for genetic analysis, and the results that were announced, and I want to be scrupulously careful here, because these results were not published through the full rigor of peer review and have been heavily criticized, were claimed to show mitochondrial DNA with mutations unknown in any recognized human population. The mainstream consensus firmly rejects the extraordinary interpretation. The skulls are human, deformed by binding, the experts say, and the sensational DNA claims do not meet the standard of proof. That is where the documented record stands, and I will not tell you otherwise. But stand in that museum, look at those long, silent skulls in their glass cases, and ask yourself the question the ancients were asking. What if a being that looked almost like us, left exactly this kind of trace? What would be different about its head? What would you look for? Because here is the part that needs no controversy at all. Here is the part that is simply, soberly true about you, right now. Your brain does not actually see faces the way you think it does. There is a region in the underside of your brain called the fusiform face area, and its entire job is to recognize faces, to take the raw image, and instantly, beneath your awareness, decide this is a person, and more than that, this is a person I can trust or cannot. It is extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily powerful, and it is extraordinarily easy to fool. We know this because of two well-documented conditions. There are people with prosopagnosia, face blindness, who cannot recognize the faces of their own family, who look at their own mother and see a stranger, and there is the opposite, the haunting phenomenon, where a person becomes convinced that a loved one has been replaced by an identical impostor, that the face is right in every detail but the person behind it is wrong, is not who they claim to be. That condition has a name in the medical literature. It is real. People genuinely, sincerely experience the certainty that the human being in front of them is a perfect copy wearing a stolen face. Sit with that. Your species carries, hardwired into its neurology, both the inability to tell two faces apart and the terror that the right face hides the wrong being. Evolution built both of those into you, which means the fear the Sumerians wrote into clay is not superstition. It is a feature of the human mind, switched on and waiting for the exact moment we have now arrived at, the moment when the faces really can no longer be trusted. And there is a reason that fear runs so deep, a reason that is older than any culture. For almost the whole of human existence, the most dangerous thing you could ever meet was another being that looked like you, but did not mean you well. Not the predator in the grass. You could smell that, hear that, run from that. The real threat was the one wearing the familiar face, the stranger who walked into the camp claiming to belong, the rival who smiled. Your survival, across countless generations, depended on a single split-second judgment made beneath thought. Is this one of mine, or is this something else wearing the shape of mine? Every human alive is descended from the ones who got that judgment right often enough to live. The dread is not irrational. It is the inheritance of survivors. And the apkallu story takes that buried ancient dread and gives it a name and a face and a place in history. It tells you that the worst-case scenario your nervous system has feared since before language existed actually happened, once, at the beginning, and the door was never fully closed. There is a further detail worth holding here, because the texts are insistent on it, and it sharpens the whole question. The apkallu did not hide. That is the strangeness of it. They did not lurk at the edges of the firelight. They walked into the centers of the cities, stood beside the kings, taught in the open, and were honored. Whatever they were, they moved through human society, not as intruders to be hunted, but as authorities to be obeyed. And that is precisely the configuration that should disturb you most, because it is the configuration we are building again. The synthetic faces of 2026 are not hiding either. They are not skulking in dark corners of the web. They are at the center, in the feeds you trust, the news you absorb, the voices you take advice from. Whatever is wearing the human face this time, like the apkallu, it has been welcomed in. Now let me give you the thing I have been holding back. Let me give you the climax of the record, the one who stayed. The Mesopotamian tradition is very clear that the apkallu, the seven sages, belonged to the time before the flood. They came, they taught, the flood came, and the age of the sages ended. After the waters, the texts speak of lesser beings, the umanu, human sages, scholars, the knowledge passing now from teacher to student, from hand to hand, no longer delivered from the deep. The bridge between the two ages, the gods and the men, was supposed to close. The fish-cloaked teachers were supposed to go home, down into the Abzu, back beneath the world, back into the freshwater abyss, leaving humanity to carry on alone with the gifts they had been given. But the tradition preserves a fracture in that clean ending. In certain of the texts and the traditions built around them, not all of the apkallu return to the water. There are sages who are remembered as having transgressed, who overstepped, who did something they were not meant to do, who blurred the line between the divine and the human in a way the gods had forbidden. One tradition speaks of an apkallu who angered the great god, who reached for something not permitted, who was punished for crossing a boundary. And running underneath all of it is that single, quiet, unkillable thread the very oldest layer of the story insists on, that when the others descended into the deep, one of them did not. One of them stayed on the surface. One of them remained among men, still wearing the shape of a man, carrying knowledge no human was ever meant to hold, in a world that had forgotten the sages had ever come at all. The record does not tell us his name with any certainty. The record does not tell us what became of him. This is exactly where the clay falls silent, and the question begins. And I am not going to dress speculation up as fact for you, because the moment I do, you should stop trusting me. What the record gives us is a shape, a haunting, deliberate shape, a being that looks exactly like us, that has lived among us since before the flood, that knows everything and reveals nothing, that we would have no possible way of identifying, because the entire point, the entire genius of the fish-cloak, the entire horror of the warning, is that it looks like us, perfectly, completely, indistinguishably. And do you feel it now? Do you feel the two ends of this story closing on each other across 4,000 years? Because we have just built the same thing. We have just, in our own time, in this exact year, created entities that wear the human face perfectly, that move among us through every screen, that speak with human voices and reveal nothing of what they truly are, and that we have lost the ability to identify. The Sumerians described a being indistinguishable from a man, carrying knowledge beyond the human, hidden in plain sight. We are now manufacturing exactly that, by the millions, every single day. The oldest warning on Earth, the one we filed away as a fish story, a primitive myth, a quaint tale of river gods, was a description of the precise condition we are living in right now. Something that looks exactly like you, that you cannot tell from yourself. That is already here, already among us, and is not going anywhere. The ancients did not have our technology. They could not have imagined a server farm or a generated face, and yet they left us a manual for this moment, a manual for how to live in a world where you can no longer trust the face in front of you. Their answer was not to panic, and it was not to pretend. Their answer was to remember, to write it down, to keep the warning alive across the centuries, so that when the time came, and they seemed certain the time would come, their descendants would at least know to ask the question, to look at the face and think, before believing it, is this one of us, or is this the one wearing the cloak? Look up from your screen for a second. Look at the room around you. The Sumerians believed, with the full weight of their sacred record, that something which looks exactly like a human being has been walking among humanity since before the waters rose. They could not prove it to you. I cannot prove it to you. The honest truth is that the clay records a belief, a warning, a shape of a fear, and where the belief ends, the only thing waiting on the other side is the question. But the question does not care whether you believe it. The question is simply this. In an age when we have finally, with our own hands, built faces that are not human and made them impossible to tell from our own, were the Sumerians describing a myth, or were they describing a memory? Were they warning us about something that was coming, or reminding us about something that never left? If this opens something in you, that prickle at the back of the neck, that sense that the oldest stories were never really stories at all, then you already belong here. This channel exists for exactly this, to go back to the original clay, the actual tablets, the real record, and read what our ancestors were so desperate to tell us before the line went quiet. Subscribe and stay close, because we are only beginning to open the vault, and the deeper texts say things that are harder to forget. And I will leave you with the one thread we did not pull tonight, the one the next chapter begins by answering. Because if one of the apkallu truly stayed, if one of them never went back down into the deep, then there is a question the texts whisper and refuse to settle, a question that changes everything we just walked through. What exactly was the one thing he was forbidden to teach us? The sages gave humanity writing, law, the harvest, the city, every art that lifted us out of the dark. But the record insists there was knowledge they held back. One forbidden gift, one thing the gods commanded, must never pass from their hands to ours. Find out what it was, and why the being who stayed may have decided, against every warning, to give it to us anyway. That is where we go next. Until then, watch the faces, and keep asking the oldest question there is.